Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Ostler. My guest on today's podcast is my new friend, Lori LeVar Pierce. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Richard. I'm glad to be here.
A volunteer at Exponent 2 reached out to me named Rosie and just mentioned to me that Exponent 2 is celebrating 50 years as a publication. And since that message, I've tried to learn more about Exponent 2. I've been aware of Exponent 2 and their great work, but I just thought it would be great for our listeners to understand more about Exponent 2. And Lori LeVar Pierce is the president of Exponent 2 and has agreed to come on the podcast to talk about Exponent 2. But just a little bit about Lori. I'll give you a little bit of bio, and I might not get this exactly right, listeners, so Lori will kind of patch up any holes. She grew up in the South, like my wife. People that grow up in the South love the South. It doesn't ever seem to leave them. So she's lived in Florida and Arkansas and a couple other states. And she came, like my wife, to BYU and got an undergraduate degree in French and German teaching, and then got an MBA from BYU with a focus in international marketing. I also have that same degree from BYU, although I'm probably a lot older. And then you had a corporate career in marketing research, which is something I really love. I love sort of the analytical side of understanding things, and I'm very much drawn to numbers and trying to make good quantitative decisions, including working for UPS Corporation in Atlanta. And then along the way, you got married and have 3 kids. You've been at home for 10 years. And then you moved 21 years ago to Columbus, Mississippi, and raised your 3 kids there with your husband. We'll talk more about your kids, who all 3 are queer. So you're the mom of 3 queer kids and can help other parents. They're navigating the road of having queer kids. And about 10 years ago, you went back into the workforce, and you've been teaching since 2010. So that's 14 years. And when you stick Lori's name in a Google search engine, you get all this wonderful content, nothing negative, just positive, including being named Teacher of the Year in an area I'll missay this, Mississippi Foreign Language Association a few years ago. So I love that you're using your undergraduate degree to teach French and German and beyond. And my impression is Lori LeVar Pierce is somebody that's helping tremendously in our LDS space. She's a practicing Latter-day Saint, and Exponent 2 is providing a platform for women, LDS women, across the broad spectrum to share their voices and insight. But you're also, I sense, doing a lot in your community, like many other Latter-day Saints. It doesn't show up on LDS tools, but doing so much good for younger people, including being an LGBTQ allies. I'm recognizing you're very connected to that space and very supportive. Exponent 2, listeners, is a quarterly magazine. It has a blog. Often blog posts are published daily. I recognize some of your bloggers, terrific women. You also have a wonderful annual retreat. And in the show notes, we'll link to all the things we're going to talk about at Exponent 2, so you can connect with their wonderful content, and also how to reach Lori LeVar Pierce if you want to reach her. Is that okay for an introduction, Lori?
That's great. I'm going to make one teeny tweak
Please
that I think is going to be important for your listeners. Exponent 2 started on the platform of women, but we now specifically mention that Exponent 2 is for women and other gender minorities to make it inclusive. So I just want to make sure that your listeners understand that.
That is great. Well, we're going to learn more about Exponent 2, your personal story, a little bit about raising queer kids. So I'll just kind of let you start wherever you want to start.
Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to turn those dings off. So let's start back with the women's exponent so that we can put this in perspective. I kind of like chronological stuff. The women's exponent was started in 1872 by Louisa Lula Green Richards, who was a grandniece of Brigham Young. And it was a newspaper published quarterly by the women who were part of the General Relief Society. It was always housed in the same building as the General Relief Society, though I don't know that it was ever officially sanctioned as a church publication, but it was certainly approved of. Brigham Young helped Louisa organize the initial Women's Exponent, brought Eliza R. Snow in to help consult as she was beginning that. Louisa Lula Green Richards, I would say her whole name, was married just a couple of years after she started the Women's Exponent. So she brought in Emmeline Wells as an assistant editor in 1874. And by 1877, Emmeline was the primary editor, the main editor of the Women's Exponent, and held that position the entirety of the paper's existence at that point, which went to 1912, I believe, is when the last edition was published. And eventually they created the Relief Society magazine, I think was sort of the substitute for that. But what's really amazing about the Women's Exponent and why it inspired the women in Boston to restart an organization, well, not restart, but create an organization called Exponent 2 in its honor, was the vast variety of opinions that got shared. It was all of the women's voices that were published. And a lot of voices about equality. The early women's leaders in the Relief Society were very much a part of the movement for women getting the vote. They were personal friends with the women who ran that national. Susan B. Anthony had, I believe, if I don't have this incorrect, she came to Utah. If it wasn't Susan B. Anthony, it was others who were leaders in that national organization. They knew them. They were at the conferences. They wrote about the need for equality for women. Well, they also wrote about how to keep your husbands happy and be a good wife. It was all in the same newspaper. So then when women in Boston who were working on an institute class teaching about the history of women came across this newspaper, it inspired them for the need to continually hear women's voices. We get a lot of male voices in the scriptures and in the church, and we don't get nearly as many of the women's voices. And so they created Exponent 2 initially as a magazine, initially as a newspaper, and then has become a magazine, always been published quarterly. And the whole idea has been, it was built on the twin components of feminism and Mormonism. And it, as I mentioned, it is for women, but has also expanded to gender minorities. At the same time, we've also expanded the definition of Mormonism to include anyone in that spectrum, whether you are currently a church, whether you are not sure if you want to be there, whether you have decided that is definitely not the place for you, but you still like people who have been in the Mormon space. We try to make space for all of those people in our organization. And we publish a quarterly magazine. We publish the blog, as you said, and then we have an annual retreat in Boston where people come in together in person. And that, I will just say this, we do our best to model this inclusive community in all of these pillars, but the retreat is really where I think it's done the best. From the very moment everybody comes to the very first introductions, we make sure everyone understands that this is a space where everyone is welcome. We ask them to give trust because there's not enough time to earn that trust, but we ask that it be a gift for that weekend, that anything anyone shares is in a safe and welcoming environment. And we've gotten some really good feedback about how that space has really, really been welcoming to anybody who walks in. Not perfectly, obviously, but generally, I think we do a pretty good job. And then we just do our best, like I said, to model that in what we publish in the magazine as well as on the blog. So that's the Exponent story. I'll give you a moment. I like to pause and give you a moment to say something.
That's just great. Keep sharing.
So let me tell you a little bit about how I found Exponent, because it really intertwines in what happened with my own queer children. I was getting very involved in feminist sorts of things and started attending retreats, not the Exponent 2 retreat initially. There are other feminist retreats around the country, and we support those. The women of Exponent generally attend many of those: Midwest Pilgrims, Allegheny Pilgrims, Rocky Mountain Retreat, Pilgrimage in Utah, and I was at one of those. And this was before I knew any of my children were queer. And there was a lot of talk at this particular retreat about the challenges of being LGBTQ in the church. And it was new information for me at that point. Like I always felt like I was tolerant, but I had not been to a point where I had really thought much about it. And it was actually Jody England Hansen. You may know her name. Jody was there, and I said, Jody, we had one afternoon. I said, Jody, will you just take a walk with me and talk to me about how you feel about this? Because this is new for me, and I'm encountering some new thoughts. And she very graciously took time to explain how she thought, how she had come to some of her conclusions, and it really changed the way that I was thinking and opened my mind to some possibilities of things. And I remember at the end of that retreat thinking, oh gosh, I've got to do more to support and help the LGBTQ individuals in the church. And then I also realized that I'm only one person and I have limited resources, and women's equality was really the thing that I cared the most about. And I'm like, well, I'm going to have to focus on women's equality. I'm appreciative of the information. I will always be, better for it, but my focus is going to have to be on women and equality. Well, and apparently my heavenly parents got a good laugh at that, because they sent me 3 queer children. I was not able to set that aside. So I very quickly had to educate myself even more and become a strong advocate for my children. And so it really helped. It helped the first time I went to an Exponent 2 retreat. One of my favorite parts about it was getting to meet both women who identified as queer, or women and gender minorities, right? So the women and gender, or the mothers of these LGBTQ youth who would talk to me about that journey and what it looked like and what the best practices were and how to be the best kind of support and parent in those situations. And so I was really, really grateful for that information. There were many times that I attended this retreat and even other retreats with a really heavy heart and some really deep concerns about what was happening with my children, both not always because they were LGBTQ. There were also mental health challenges, and as I'm sure most parents are aware, with anxiety and depression and suicidality and all of those things. And I really learned a lot and felt like I got a lot of support from the people that I interacted with at Exponent 2. So then when it came an opportunity for me to be part of that and help create a space that reaches more people, I jumped at that chance.
Thank you for sharing that. And Jody England Hansen is awesome. And there's so many wonderful women that, as I've read through the bloggers that are just terrific and have helped me better understand issues. It's a little bit of a tangent, but the word feminist can be triggering sometimes in our LDS community. In fact, I sort of came to the conclusion on Twitter one day, because I started to use that men who take on that label get less flack than women who take on that label.
Yeah, I think so. And that has been I have been desensitized, if you will, to that, because I just truly believe feminism is about women getting to make the choices themselves for their own lives.
The talk about taking on the feminist label is consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ. You did that just right then, but if you want to expand on that, Lori.
Yeah. No, I really feel like it doesn't. A lot of the pushback that comes, I think, against feminism, especially in Mormonism, is people think that feminists are giving you they're saying women have to be a certain way. And that's actually really generally the opposite. Not that there aren't feminists that say you have to be this, that, and the other thing to really count yourself as feminist, but really and truly the heart of feminism is the ability for women to conscientiously make the choices about their own lives. And I'll throw in a personal anecdote about this. When my husband and I were deciding about having children, we both were making the same amount of money. But it was important to us that one of us stay at home. We had been raised with that value. I had been raised with that strong, particular value. And that was something that we wanted. And there are lots of other ways to do that. I'm not saying that's the only way, but for us, that was the way. And for me, I made the choice to be the one to stay at home, because I had been the one who had been taught how to be a stay-at-home parent, and my husband had not. But it was really important to me, as I stepped away from my work, from my job, especially a job that I really loved at UPS in corporate market research, that I was doing that because I made the choice to do it. I wasn't leaving a job that I was not successful at. I was actually very successful at that job. My manager, when he signed my card, was like, I really wish I were signing your promotion papers instead of your going away card.
Wow.
And even though UPS had a policy that if you had a job and you left it, you could never come back again to work at UPS. He told me they would make an exception in my case. And so knowing that I had consciously made that choice really helped, especially when parenting became challenging, that I didn't feel like I had been pushed into that. Yes, I had been taught that, but when it came time to make the decision, I really made a conscious decision. And to me, that's feminism, that I was able to make that choice. And then when it became better for me to go back into the workforce, my children were all in school and I had more to contribute, then I made that choice as well.
It's really
so
helpful.
That to me, that's what feminism is.
Would you like to talk more about Exponent 2? Would you like me to ask questions about being a parent of an LGBTQ kiddo, or just wherever you want to go?
We can talk about both. I definitely want to talk about Exponent. Let me talk a little bit about Exponent 2. And
talk about Exponent 2. Listeners, that's the primary focus of this podcast.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we all get a good understanding of Exponent 2 and how to get involved if we want to.
Yes, because Exponent 2, again, we're celebrating 50 years. In July of this year, it was the 50th anniversary of the very first issue of Exponent 2. And what it started out as a newspaper and has become a magazine, a blog, and a retreat, has really been a boon for many women and gender minorities who want to share their stories. And I will say this as I share my story, because there's one particular blog post that I wrote several years ago having to do specifically with my own LGBTQ children, and primarily my oldest child who identifies as trans, and what happened in my own local ward. And what I did was I had an experience at church that I didn't say anything about when I was at church, but then came home and wrote a blog post about it. And I think that happens a lot for women who write with Exponent. They have an experience that they cannot, and in the moment, they can't say what they want to say. They have feelings, they have their concerns, but they don't have an avenue to say anything about it to make it. And anyway, just to get all that out. And so Exponent 2 becomes that place where those feelings and those words can reside, where you can write it, share what you think, and then it goes out to a broader audience. And we share experiences. The core of Exponent 2, the mission statement that we have, is that we share our personal stories in a safe and welcoming environment that we might build a stronger community together. And I think it's the same mission statement that you have, Richard, in what you do with this podcast. Individual stories are what touch people's hearts. And at its core, that's what we are at Exponent 2. Now, I should also say, I don't want to forget this. One of the things that we have in the more recent history have expanded into art. The artwork that is being included in our magazine is amazing. We now have an art piece paired with every written article. And we have an amazing group of artists who contribute art for us to use in the magazine and elsewhere. We just today, I shouldn't get off the podcast without saying we started a fundraiser to try and make sure that Exponent continues for another 50 years. And for those who contribute, there's a giveaway for a swag bag, if you will, of Exponent things. And there's also, at a higher level, we will give you a canvas wrapped 8x10 of some of the artwork that we contributed for the 50th anniversary. So we just want enough funds to continue being around and not have to stress about it.
We'll link to that fundraiser, listeners, and obviously Exponent 2, so you can connect with that. I'm reading your guest post, what I wanted to say in testimony meeting. Yeah. I think you sent me that link, and
yes,
I think there's a lot of times in church we want to share something, and our heart rate. This is me speaking, listeners, as a dude.
Yes,
I feel this sometimes where my heart rate goes up. I've been triggered a little bit by a comment, but our culture sometimes doesn't allow. We're taught to kind of get along really well and not make waves. Maybe that's inferred versus directly communicated. So often I just leave church at the end of the hour and process that on my walk or with my wife. But I think there's a real need for that space. And I hope that as we mature as a church, that we're able to have more of these conversations at church, but that may not be possible for everybody. So I love these guest posts. And I think it helps me understand the perspective of others so that I can not say the triggering comment as a male and say better things to support women and not sort of the things sometimes I might say or men might say that aren't as informed as they would be if they listened to women's voices.
And that works the same for women, right? I mean, for men, it's about women's voices, but for me, it was about learning what it's like to be LGBTQ, to learn what it's like to be a woman of color, to learn what it is like to be a woman with disabilities. I have never been any of those women. I have had connections. My father was disabled. He was a polio survivor. My children are all queer. I live in Mississippi, so I deal with racism issues. But hearing those personal stories from people helped me understand how I can be better in all of those spaces. And it takes hearing from people. And sometimes, I'll be honest, women willing to stand up and say, you are wrong, don't do it this way. And as long as they do that with kindness and gentleness, and I have generally found that within Exponent 2, then that's an easy way for me to listen to that.
That's great. Keep sharing about Exponent 2.
Well, I could go on and on and on. I love it. We're in the midst of so much. The fundraiser just started today. Retreat registration closed today. That's what all these things are. They're all Exponent 2 messages that are going through. But I love working with the individuals that I work with in Exponent 2 because I genuinely feel like everyone has this same focus, that we just want to make sure that people are included, whether we do it perfectly all of the time. Obviously not. There's always room for improvement, but we are constantly seeking with that as a value and constantly trying to figure out how do we bring in the voices of people that have not had a chance to have their voice heard here. And I just love that we continue to have guest posts, people who submit to the magazine, writing or artwork for the very first time. We also, in this 50th year, we were trying to figure out some ways to rebuild community. And so we've had 3 so far in-person events that are not the retreat. We had one in Provo, we had one in Minneapolis, and I was at one in Atlanta just a few weekends ago. And this was fun. After the weekend, the one in Atlanta, we started at 6 and we didn't break up until 10:30 at night, just in a discussion. And the woman who was hosting, her husband was not there, but was in the home and occasionally heard some of the conversations. And at the end of the evening, he came out and his comment was, it just really sounds like these women need these conversations. And I think that's true. I think that's what Exponent exists for, is for the opportunity to have conversations about things that matter to us, that matter to women and other gender minorities, experiences that we have, and expertise that we can share. Like I said, I learned a lot about being the parent of queer children by the people that I talked to, the individuals that I spoke with at Exponent 2, where they shared their own personal experiences. So to me, that's the important part. And we want to continue growing that and inviting as many people as can to share that with us and help us grow that.
Those are sacred places.
Yes, I would definitely.
A place where people can be honest and vulnerable, and they're met with vulnerability and honesty is so healing and helpful. In my experience, even though people don't know the answers, just to be able to be heard in a safe place. And listeners, one of the things I worry about a little bit in our church is the ability to do that is decreased with just a 2-hour church and Relief Society every other week, and maybe less events than we used to have historically in our church. And, I love going to the temple, but it's not a place where there's a lot of, discussion. It's not like Jesus in the synagogue where, and maybe women weren't there, so that's not a good example, but where we're all kind of talking and sharing and communicating. And I just think the need for community and authentic connection there's a real need in Latter-day Saint community for that. So when you say this Atlanta meeting, Lori, that you start really early and you go real late, my guess is people just love the chance to talk.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like you read a recent blog post. One of our bloggers, Candace Went, wrote
I
about
did read her post.
yeah, the substituting community with covenants in the LDS Church, and I just found that a very, very powerful commentary on what we have done. And you're exactly right. I feel that in my ward, like I stay after, but by 20 minutes after, everybody else is gone, and I've not had a chance to connect, and then I don't see them for the rest of the week.
We'll link to Candace's blog because it really helped me, listeners. And you're right. It just, I mean, she put vocabulary, some of the things I was seeing and feeling that were really helpful. And I think I messaged her and told her how much her blog impacted me and helped me.
Good. Well, and I will say this, let me go back in history just a little bit, because I should also not finish the podcast without telling you that there is a history of Exponent written by Katie Rich and Heather Sundial that is coming out at the end of August. Pre-orders are already in for this particular book, and they go through the 50 years of Exponent 2 history with a lot of content from what has been included in both the magazine and the blog. And they point out that in many points along the way in history, Exponent has been a little bit, sometimes on the cutting edge, sometimes a little bit behind, obviously not perfect, but we have been writing about homosexuality back in the 1990s. In fact, I will mention Katie sent me some specific things from the book that impacted Exponent 2 back in, I'm going to get the year here, 1982. Exponent 2 published an entire issue on sexuality. And Affirmation called us out for not including homosexuality in that issue. And we acknowledge that and apologize for it. We want to learn, right? I have always found that, but then got better. We have published entire issues on homosexuality. In fact, there is one where Judy Dushku wrote an extended editorial for the beginning of that, which is really powerful. That editorial is in the book, The 50 Years of Exponent 2, as well. We also, the policy issue, the policy of exclusion, when that came in, that was very impactful in our community, both in terms of what we discussed, in terms of the individuals in our community, what their relationship to the church was like. Through all of that had a very strong impact. So we've always kind of been in the middle of that, right? There was also an issue in 2012 entitled Zion's Frontier, the LGBTQ Journey of Faith. So we have always tried to create a lot of space, and there are one of the most recent magazine articles, I'm pretty sure it was a magazine article that was written, was about a transgender woman and her experience buying garments for the first time as a woman rather than a man, and what that felt like. There was another one 2 or 3 years ago from a board member about her experience when she changed her name, and where she went and how they thought about it, and how they made that change. So we definitely welcome all of those things. They are all part of the experience of being a woman or a gender minority. And we really like sharing all of those stories because we learn from them. We all do.
I love that you're willing to be in all these spaces and bring stories to other people. It gives us vocabulary, it gives us insights. Latter-day Saints want to do the right thing, but we often have so little exposure to some of these unique situations that we don't know what to do. So often I don't say anything, and then I miss my chance to do better and minister better. And so I love the content you're bringing forward, and you all have been in this space for a long time.
Yeah.
It's not like this is a new thing. And that's really remarkable. 50 years of doing this, 150, you go back to Sister Richards, if I'm getting her name right. That's really cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Although I think Emmeline Wells is probably much more well known for the Women's Exponent, since she led it for most of 40 years.
Just a side note, listeners, about my mom, just to tell you a little bit about her. She's in her 90s, and she went back to school after raising us. She went to the University of Utah and finished a master's degree in art history, and she focused on Lee Green Richards, a Utah artist. And I just finally figured out the connection that he is the daughter of Louise Lula Green Richards. So
there's your connection.
I knew that name was familiar, and I just texted my mom, who's a great texter at 91, 92. But there's also credit to my mom because, she did things based on the principle you're teaching is very much personal revelation that was right for her and not typical at the time. I remember going to college as an undergraduate and my mom was a graduate student. I thought that was kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really respected her for doing things a little outside the box and using her God-given talents in art history. And to especially talk about this, I think, this LDS artist, Lee Green Richards, and his family. I'd love to talk to you, and you can still talk about Exponent too, but younger Latter-day Saint women that are in their teens and 20s, and sometimes what they feel church culture is asking them to do is different than what they feel they want to do or what their peers outside the church, women peers outside the church are doing. And this regards to career and graduate school and careers that are atypical for women according to the culture. And you've navigated this, with your own personal story, but I bet you've had hundreds of conversations with younger Latter-day Saint women that are trying to find their place, just trying to be authentic the way they want to live their life and also be supported by church culture that might have expectations for them. Do you want to talk to them? And maybe it helps guys too. I realize you can't talk to each of them individually, but I know
Right.
I just sense you've had hundreds of these conversations, just principles that you'd share with them as they're writing their story.
So a lot of the younger teenagers that I talk to are my students who are not LDS. So much of what I do is not necessarily framed in the LDS context, but it definitely applies. And I will say my life has been guided by what I label as personal inspiration. I do feel like there has been a guiding hand. That's one of the things that keeps me in the church. That and the fact that I think I grew up in a tiny branch where I was used to the church was what we created it here, and so the church is what I create for myself. My children, who 2 of my 3 don't ever darken the door of the church, but they have told me, in fact, just this week I was visiting each of them as I traveled around the Western U.S. And they said, look, we had no problem with anything you taught us at home, but the things that we heard in the church building were a lot more challenging for us. And in their case, it turned them away to them not wanting to come back. So I would love to be able to tell the youth of the church to focus on the things that do feel right to you and try to let go of the things that don't feel right to you. Right. That make you feel bad. My youngest, I will tell you this, it was my middle daughter who was the first one who came out as LGBTQ. And it came out at a point in which her friends texted me one morning and said, Anna has a suicide plan for tonight.
Wow.
And that was how we started that journey. As it turned out, she had realized she was bisexual and was hearing a lot of negative things in the church environment that pushed her towards suicidality. And we were able to navigate that. I consider it a huge relief. Not that it's over when your kids hit 21, but all of my children are 21 years of age and alive. And to me, that is a huge blessing. And it took a lot of work. Not that it was all my credit, obviously, but I certainly was down in the trenches with them a lot of that time. But what I often tell my students as they're struggling with what to do with their lives, college, for them it's college, career, what are the right choices? I tell them to walk through the doors that open in front of you. And I think that has to do with personal revelation as well. In the church experience, we would say follow the inspiration that comes to you. But I think many times we don't walk through doors that open in front of us because of fear or because someone has said that's not the right door for you, even if we feel it is. And if I could tell the youth of the church anything, it is to walk through those doors that open in front of you and don't let fear or someone else's expectation of what you should or shouldn't be keep you from doing what you feel is the right thing in your life.
I love that. No one's used that visual imagery. That's really powerful, Lori.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts that come to your mind on that question? You went to MBA school, and there's kind of a cultural expectation that women that go to graduate school might not do MBA school. Back in 1988 at BYU, I think it was like 90% men and few women.
Mhm.
And there were probably just as many LDS women qualified to be in MBA school, but they just didn't culturally feel that was the right path for them. So, just any more on walking through the door that's in front of you.
I will say this, that I think I have been incredibly lucky in the mentors that I have had and the people that I have interacted with, though there were only about 10 women in my MBA program out of 120 men. I didn't get that strong of I never got an impression that I didn't deserve to be there. Let's say that. And that seems to be a little bit unusual at BYU from some of the other women that I have spoken to in that. So I was lucky in that. I also had, there was the assistant MBA director at that time was Kay Hansen, who was really an amazing individual.
And I remember,
do you know her? Yeah.
I remember the name.
The name. One of the pieces of advice she gave us as women as we were getting ready to interview for jobs after we left, she said, do not answer questions about your life that isn't happening right now. For instance, if someone says, what do you plan to do when you get married and have children? She said, unless you are married and have children, don't answer that question. Just say, right now, my focus is on working. She said, you will, when you get married and when you have children, you will adjust, but do not plan your life for that and limit it. Plan your life for the reality that is right now. And that was really powerful advice from her that I have never forgotten and always managed. Again, I had a career. I didn't cut short what I could do because I was planning to be, I did one. If I have one regret, it would have been not getting a joint MBA JD when I was getting that at BYU. I was just afraid one more year would be too much debt and I was just going to get married anyway. And why do that? And I wish I had done that. But beyond that, I pursued my career. And then when marriage and children opportunity came along, I adjusted and then I readjusted back. Life is always a series of adjustments. It never flows quite the way that you think it does. But I have been really lucky in that I have met a lot of people along the way that have encouraged me to do the best that I can do, to be out there. And my husband is also one of them. I have to give him some credit. He's really happy that I get to go out and do the things that matter to me. Being the president of Exponent matters to me a lot just because of what I'm able to do. I will say this, you'll appreciate this. Since you have an MBA, I remember in one of our organizational classes, one of the professors telling us that the skills we were learning in the MBA program would be applicable not just in our work lives, but also in our church callings. And I didn't realize this is actually part of my ordained women profile. I said, I didn't realize until years later that they weren't talking to me. Because there really aren't church callings where I can use my MBA skills that I have gained.
Wow.
But in Exponent 2, I can. And to me, that feels like my church calling, my biggest one. I still have 2 other callings in my ward, ward music chair and the ward media coordinator. But to me, that's an important use of the skills that I learned at BYU. And I've just been lucky to be in for me, it feels like the right places at the right times and meeting some of the right people.
I love that you recognize that you don't feel like your MBA skills have been totally used within your church calling, but you sort of walked through the door in front of you at some point and found that you're able to use your skills in Exponent 2. And that doesn't show up on LDS tools. And I just think, listeners, that it's good for us to recognize that Latter-day Saints are serving in a variety of places. And sometimes we pray for those and culturally supportive those that have major LDS tools callings, and that's good. Mm-hmm. They need our support and our prayers. But I think we can just kind of be more intuitive of the way people serve in other ways. Teaching or, in our community service, there's so many different ways, and they're building Zion, they're helping people feel God's love, they're building communities. So I think it's just part of, and honoring people that do that and spend a significant amount of time. Talk about, you can handle this question. I'm pretending to be a younger Latter-day Saint woman right now, and I'm accomplished. I'm educated. I'm everywhere I go as a woman. There's no ceiling for me. In my company, I'm excelling, equal to men. My gifts and talents aren't muted because I'm a woman. Every circle I'm in, except the church, I'm an equal. And yet, when I go to church, I'm not. I don't have the same potential because I'm not male and I don't hold the priesthood. And I'm not sure I want to raise my daughters in the church in an organization that doesn't let them fully be. I'm using vocabulary that some in the church might not agree with. Fully be who they could be in an organization that's run by men and is a priesthood organization. But yet, I'd like to kind of stay in the church. I just don't. My goal is to stay, but how do I navigate that? So that's an hour podcast, Lori.
Yeah.
But I know it's a question you understand very well. And I don't know if you want to just give general principles answers of how your advice to me.
So I'm a little hesitant only because speaking to youth and speaking to those between 18 and 25 is a very, very different exercise. But I would speak more to those who are a little bit older. I think the youth they still need teaching and training, right? And that's what parents are for. Although they definitely make their own choices. But one of the really important things to me has been taking charge of my own spirituality. And while, yes, I do subject myself to interviews for Temple Recommends for worthiness, I have had issues with leaders who have threatened and taken away recommends because they disagreed with some of my views. And when I finally came to the personal decision and recognition that my personal spirituality is not in the hands of anyone but me. No one else gets to tell me about my relationship with my heavenly parents. That once I gave myself that freedom, then what happened at church just didn't bother me nearly as much. I'm there until they're going to drag me out the door at this point. And I recognize that that's also a place of privilege. There are many people who have walked away from that environment because it has been difficult. And I completely support that. I support my children who have walked away, that what happened at church was very toxic for them. And I do not blame them for not being there. But for me, it is me taking charge and recognizing that I'm the one, again, not choice. I'm the one that chooses on Sunday morning to get up and go to church. I could easily choose not to. There have been a couple of mornings my husband's like, I really don't feel like going to church. And I'm like, honey, you do realize that you're a grown adult and you can decide to stay home if you want, right? And just that choice matters, not feeling like someone is making you do something. Yes, there are generally expectations, but being able to walk away from that and honing in. And if I can say this in an LDS context, learn how to listen to your own revelation. Learn how to get that for yourself, how to trust it. That's actually really hard, is to learn how to trust it, especially if it isn't in line with everything you're hearing from church leaders. But if I can invoke one particular example was pretty something we discussed a fair amount on the Exponent blog when President Camille Johnson talked about her experience being a mother and still working full time. Like, we applaud that decision. That is wonderful that she did that for herself and she followed, as she said, let God prevail. But that wasn't what was being taught to young women at that time. And she had to have the strength of her own convictions to be able to do what was right for her. And I just wish that more and more young women and older women and young men and older men felt that they had that same permission to know how to create their own spiritual life and be in charge of it themselves.
That's a terrific answer.
Thanks.
And I just sense you're very sensitive to people that are walking different roads, and you're just trying to honor everybody's story, but sharing your story and why it works for you. And I'm aware of President Camille Johnson's story, and I wish she would address, how she navigated that kind of directly using, some of the principles that you shared of just getting personal revelation. Her personal revelation maybe even acknowledging that it was different than the general direction given at the time of the church, and how she navigated that, because I think a lot of people are trying to walk a similar road given where we are today on different issues. And so I love that story, and I wish there was just a little more clarity on how she navigated that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we all kind of wanted.
And recognize that, we didn't call professional women in our church,
Right.
with at some point, and now we're calling women like that, and we said different messages. So I wish we kind of discussed that and just recognize it's an ongoing revelation, ongoing restoration, and maybe sometimes actively untaught things we used to teach so that people understand we're not teaching stuff we used to teach. And that's a really good one.
Yeah, that's an important thing. I really wish in so many areas that we had more instruction about the church is not teaching, not just that they stopped it, but they're telling people, no, we don't teach this anymore.
Talk about, why you stay in the church. You've got a lot of reasons to leave. You've got three, queer kids. It sounds like 2 out of the 3 don't attend, and you're aware of the complexities of the church, and you could on a lot of merit's not the right word, but you could leave. And you've seen wonderful people walking a similar road that have left. There's a lot of people that want to stay it's really hard for them to stay, and because they've got queer kids that don't really have a place and are hurt by the church with some of the comments so you're aware of what I call church generated pain that's come into your kids' lives and maybe your life. And a lot of people, and so the source of the pain is the very thing that shouldn't be the source of the pain. So if you want to talk about why you stay, and this is not directed at people that have left to come back, it's more directed at people that also want to stay and need a voice that kind of knows the complexities of their road, or maybe a leader that wants to have better insights on how to help someone stay.
Well, let me first start off and emphasize what you said is that mine is my story and it is not prescriptive for anyone. The fact that I stay doesn't mean that I think anybody else needs to, because I definitely respect and honor those who have made the choices not to for very valid personal reasons. For me, I said this years ago, long before I ever became aware of my children's queerness, that I think one of the biggest reasons that I stay is because I grew up in a teeny tiny branch where I was needed. Like when I turned 12, my dad handed me a hymn book and said, teach yourself to lead the music because we need a chorister for sacrament meeting. And I held callings. I held stake level callings as a youth. Like I knew that my skills and talents were needed to help this organization that did good things for people. And the gospel, as I was taught it growing up, was basically what I was taught in my home. I never had a disconnect between home and church because my dad was he was the branch president until I was a senior in high school, and then he was in the stake presidency. So what he taught me at home was what I got taught at church in a tiny branch. So I learned that at his feet, from him and my mother, the way to live the gospel, which is, of course, fairly consistent still with the way that I do. My parents never lived to learn that they had queer grandchildren. And though I know that they were very open-minded about some of those things, I'm not. I often wonder how they would have reacted, though I'm sure they would have found a way to love them and accept them. But that would have been hard for them as well. As at times it was a challenge for me to figure out how to do the right thing along that path. But for me, it has come down to really personal experiences. I was in a relief society many years ago when someone issued the challenge to learn how to follow inspiration by acting on every inspired thought that you had, and just practice it for a week or whatever, a specific period of time. Don't think about, is this, where did this come from? Is it not from me? And I did that, and I have just learned to just trust those feelings that come, because when I act on them, I'm almost always doing the right thing. Like it comes back in a good way that I've done something right for someone. And so I have a dear friend who calls it the God gene. And she says about herself, I just don't have the God gene. I don't feel this spirituality, but I do. I am often in places and with people and with things that I just get that warm feeling of this is the right thing right now at the right time. And I let that guide my life. And for now, though I don't always get that feeling at church, I don't always get that feeling around the people, I don't get that feeling anywhere else that pulls me away. So the church is still, it's my home. It's what I know. It is my culture. It is what speaks to me. And it is where I feel the presence of God. And so, and I'm just stubborn enough that I'm going to be the last one out of the door. Maybe I'm just stubborn. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know. But all of those things are also part of the explanation that I use.
It's great. Terrific answer. And I love the way you create space for people to have different conclusions. And I think that's the space I'm trying to be in, listeners. And it's relieving in a way, not to be responsible for everybody's choices, but to help, but to just love everybody where they are. Unless it's a toxic relationship, you've got to find boundaries if you're an unhealthy, toxic, or even a physically unsafe relationship. But otherwise, we can just let people write their stories and try to preserve the relationship and leave it all at Christ's feet, who's the final judge. And it's relieving. I'm asking you questions now, but you have more thoughts. So we kind of balance this because I'd love you to talk to your younger self about parenting a trans kid. I got a DM overnight of a mom in crisis because she's got a trans kid, and just this heartfelt, just, and so I don't know. That's one way to answer it, is just you talking to your younger self. I don't know how many years you've been on this road, but it's also you just talking to parents, LDS parents that are newly aware that your kid is identifying as trans. And so you can take that question if you want to. Yeah. I think you'd help us.
No, I'm happy to. Actually, again, a lot of it has to do with being in the right place at the right time and knowing some of the right people. My oldest child came out as trans almost 6 years ago.
It's a long time.
So that's a fair amount of time. In fact, and he was assigned male at birth, transitioned to female pronouns, is now more in the non-binary state, he, they. So if my pronoun use varies, that is why.
You're very comfortable with the pronouns.
Yeah, very comfortable with the pronouns. But so I was lucky in that in the year that my oldest child came out to me as trans, he was in college at that point. That also is important to know. He was not living at my house, and that makes a little bit of a difference. I was teaching, and I teach 6 classes a year generally, and I had a student in every single one of those classes that was trans. And those students helped me a lot because they were willing to talk to me and correct me when I misuse pronouns or misuse things. And they knew that I cared about them and that I loved them and that I was a student or a teacher who was accepting. And that really helped me in my personal experience as well. I often now have students who are trans that I talk to about these experiences, and they say, how long did it take you to start using the right pronouns? Because they're bothered that their parents are having a difficult time transitioning to that. And my answer always is longer than my child wanted it to take. It's never fast enough. And it was really challenging. I kept trying to explain to my oldest child, like, I've just known you this way for 18 years, and my body, we have eons of biology that have taught us we can look at someone and immediately determine a gender. And then that overrides everything that we say. And you have to go against that. You have to recognize that you're going against that biology, but it's important to do that because your child needs your love and support. Here's the other thing that I don't think we talk about enough. People who are trans need help navigating that road too. It's new for them to figure out what that road looks like. One of the first things I insisted on with my child was you have got to be talking to a therapist who knows something about this, because I do not. And I cannot guide you on this road. I can be here to listen. I can educate myself as much as I can, but I am not an expert here. So we need an expert's help, an expert to talk to you, experts to talk to me, to help us navigate this. Because coming out and saying that I'm trans doesn't help you create the path that you are going to walk. and understanding what that means, understanding if that's really what's happening, and I don't mean to imply that it's not for anybody, but sometimes there are lots of other things with my child. There were lots of other things that were happening at the same time with mental health challenges that we need to straighten this all out and figure out what is actually what, so that if you're going to make some huge transitions, that you're making them with full knowledge and full confidence that that's the right path for you. And so those are the kinds of things that I would say as a parent, but your child just needs you to love them. I often have parents who try to ask me, parents who don't have trans children, don't know anything about them. They're like, what does it feel like? And I tell them, I'm like, I don't know what it feels like. I have never been trans, but that doesn't mean that I don't listen and I don't acknowledge that it does feel different for someone else. I said, you don't have to understand all of the ins and outs about this to just love these people and make them feel welcome where you are. So to me, that's the important part as a parent. Learn as much as you can. That's sort of me. I'm an educator. Like, I did a deep dive into as much research and theory as I could. But the bottom line is just listen. Let your child guide you. Listen to them. Let them tell you how they're feeling, and don't respond with judgment. Sometimes it's really, but my kids know that I am definitely not perfect at that. But I have to consciously tell myself, you're just listening. You're not telling them what to do anymore. But that's my advice to parent. And that would be my advice to my younger self, to be more prepared for that.
That's terrific. And I love that you wanted to get your kiddo to a therapist that could just, have expertise in the space and help your kiddo make good decisions. And I love that you're not sort of like denying that this is a real thing or trying to get back to a cisgender kid and talk and recognize it's complicated. But I love that you not only were thinking about you, obviously, and just what this means for you, and you need to process that, but you're also thinking about being trans isn't easy. One of the best visual imageries, listeners, to help me better understand this was Jeff and Sarah Case when they talked about Genesis. They have a trans kiddo, and they talked about light and darkness and land and sea. And they also,
I remember that. I was just listening to that podcast.
and they just talked about these minority situations that are actually beautiful. Dawn and dusk is the between stage of light and darkness. And we've developed vocabulary called dawn and dusk. And those are beautiful outcomes during the 24-hour day. We're often drawn to those. They're some of our best pictures, sometimes our most spiritual experience. Land and sea, we have marsh. That's kind of, I put a picture up in a fireside, and I said, would you call this land or sea? And it was kind of equal. And marsh is an area that is a thriving part of the environment. So I just love the non-binary or trans people and bisexual people can be in these minority situations, but they're beautiful. And parents may at first feel like having a trans kiddo is a bad outcome and not something that's desirable for a lot of Latter-day Saint families, but a lot of families and a trans person too gets to the point where this is a good outcome. Being trans is not a bad thing, and having a trans kiddo is not a bad thing. Talk about taking care of yourself, because some parents grieve, for a trans kid. They feel like they've named this kid a certain way. He or she is biologically this way, and now they've got a trans kid with different pronouns, different names. And so there's some talk about for other parents that just kind of are working through that. They want to support their trans kid, but they're also kind of working through that side of the equation.
Well, you have to allow yourself to feel the grief. It recognize that that's not unusual. That's not wrong. You have thought about this child in one way for how many years? I don't know if this actually helped that much in our situation. My oldest child is actually adopted, and we changed his name when we adopted him. So, changing it again, although we gave him a family name that honored both his birth mother's family and our family, because there was a similar name in both. And I think I can tell the story because my oldest child, I have told this story too. The first name that he picked that was a female name, we hated it. But we used it because he said that was the name that he wanted to go by. And then he changed it again later after having a little bit more discussion. We're much, much happier with the second choice and feel much better. But it's okay if you don't like the name that they pick. but you still use it, right? Because you care about your child. But it's okay to have grown-up feelings too about all of this. I have to put a shout out. I mean, Exponent 2 is a wonderful organization, but Mama Dragons is also an excellent organization. And there are a lot of people that are in both, right? But I got a lot of help from that organization as well to understand where my kiddos were coming from and how to prevent the suicidality, getting suicidality training, preventing suicide and those kinds of things. So and my kids will tell you that I definitely was not perfect in the way that I reacted initially to them. They can still, unfortunately, they remember the details of some of those bad conversations when I didn't say the right thing. But they have given me grace on that and forgiven me and recognized that I have made the effort to do better. Just because I care about them. The important part is about them, is about how they feel. Are they happy in their lives? Are they successful? And it's no longer, someone used the term the other day about my children being lost. And I said, no, my children are not lost. They know exactly where they are. They're just walking a path that's different from mine. And when it comes down to it, as parents, all of our children walk a path that is different from ours, whether they are LGBTQ or not LGBTQ or whatever. Every child is an individual with agency for his or her or their own life to make their choices, and they are not going to make the same choices that their parents will. And so to me, the skill that I learned, my children made it a little bit more, I want to say in your face, but that's not really the term I want, but a little bit more of a difference because they were LGBTQ and really like walking away from the church. Those are some big kinds of decisions where they chose some things that were different from me. But to me, that's the model for parenting. That's the model that our heavenly parents gave us. They said, here is this world we're creating for you. Here is a life, and you have full and complete agency to live your life in the way that you feel like is the right way. Here is what we think will make you happy. That's how I've always positioned the gospel to my children. Not that this is the only way to live or even an absolute right or wrong, but here is the advice we give you for how to be happy and how to live and be content with your life. And that's how I feel parenting is. That's how I feel I got from my heavenly parents. And that's what I think. If we can give our children that same gift, then that's the best thing you can do as a parent.
Love that. Believe that. How do you navigate just the next life? Because some would say, well, Lori, you won't have your family in the next life. You're going to have empty seats at the table. Having a trans kid has blown up your eternal family. And how do you navigate the next life and just find peace with children not going to church and wondering if you're not going to be eternal family in the next life?
So the short answer is, if they're not in my life now, they won't want to be in my life in the next life.
That's a powerful short answer.
And so that's the mantra that I go by. I want them to be part of my life now. And I don't know what will happen in the next life. I think there's a lot that we don't understand about how families will actually be together. And so I'm just going to have to trust that it's going to be the right way as long as I love my kids and make them want to be part of the family that we have here today.
It's good. I believe that. And I just think we need to put that at the Savior's feet, listeners, and not conclude now a future outcome. I love that some of my guests talk about my job as a parent is to preserve the relationship versus control the outcome. And that does take a two-way street. Some really good LDS parents have kids that won't talk to them, and they're doing all the things you're doing to keep the relationship going. So it does a two-way street, but often it works best if we're just doing what Lori's doing and loving and honoring and preserving the relationship versus controlling the outcome. Also noticed your trans kid changed names. And I've always thought it's easier to change something if people are supportive of where they are initially. So maybe the fact you called her, I think it goes by they now, but her at the time by that first name, it sounds like you honored that name. It wasn't your favorite female name, but eventually your trans kid will change that to a different female name. And I think there's sometimes a principle there, parents, that if we honor choices and say, I'll walk with you and that if that person feels at some point they want to change, they're not so like have their heels dug in or I've had to defend that so much that and they're not going to say, I told you so, and worried about sort of going back, that it's easier for them to, I don't know if course correction is the right word, or just an adjustment to a current course, because you still have a trans non-binary kid, but just a more thoughtful way to navigate that space because you're walking with them. So I just thought that was kind of a cool thing.
So I would throw in one thing that I did remember that I didn't say before when you were asking about church attendance, because my oldest trans child reminded me of this. And I'm going to apologize to everybody because the COVID shutdown was all my fault. Because at the time,
now we know.
No, at the time, my bishop was giving me a lot of pushback for using the female name and female pronouns with my oldest child, who was then living at our home and not attending church, but on the church records, and had been invited to a Relief Society activity and came to a luncheon that the Relief Society sisters had, and someone got all upset about it. And the bishop threatened, he literally wouldn't interview me for a temple recommend. He wouldn't let his counselors interview me, and he refused to.
Wow.
And I was trying to figure out sort of how to navigate that space. And suddenly COVID hit and all the temples were shut down and the church was shut down. And I really needed a break at that point, and I needed not to worry about a temple recommend. And so I apologized to the rest of the world. But sometimes I take breaks. And at that point I needed a break, and our bishop was actually released about 6 months after all of that happened. And we were put into a new stake and things resolved themselves. After that.
Yeah, I love your self-determination to take a break and know that was right for you, and just have the self-confidence. It's back to your personal story. You know God so well, you know our Heavenly Parents so well, and your personal revelation and your understanding of you to just take a break.
Yeah, and I have done that in the past before too. I just need to take a break sometimes.
Listeners, I wrote down a section like, what can men do to better support women? And one of the things that you're doing a lot is talking about heavenly parents. And that's doctrinally accurate. Every time we don't pray to Heavenly Mother, but every time we're talking about God or Heavenly Father, we can say heavenly parents. That's doctrinally accurate. So I've certainly tried to learn what I can do as a man in LDS culture to better support women. And in my 3 books, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but just share some. I have, whenever I can, I use the vocabulary of heavenly parents, and try to use that as much as I can. One of the training meetings I went to as a YSA bishop was ward council. And one of the things we're instructed to do is to get input from the women. So I remember going to the first ward council meeting, and we were talking about an elders quorum issue, and our Relief Society president, rightly so, wasn't too engaged because we never asked her to be engaged. Yeah. So then I turned to her and says, what do you think about this topic? And she was a bit taken back, but then she offered tremendous insight on an elders quorum issue. And it was a really powerful principle. So I share those two for men to do what we can do in our circle of influence. So we just don't put it on the women to better support women, that we have a real responsibility here to do everything we can in the circle of our influence to elevate women's voices and to validate their experiences and to help them feel belonging and needed and valued. And so that's kind of a sub-message for men, to do what we can do and just recognize, the courage it takes for women to sometimes attend church and not feel fully valued. Other things you'd like to share, Lori? Or anything I've said that is a little off you'd like to clarify?
You don't have enough time for me to share all the things that I would want to share, because I could go on and on and on about all of these different topics. But I will say one little caveat about, not a caveat, but just in addition to what you're talking about with women in church. One of the things I frequently have pushed back on church practices in terms of relating to women. Many, many years ago, it was about women speaking last in sacrament meeting. Like back when I was early married, I actually called the stake president, who corrected my bishop, who was insisting that men had to be the closing speaker.
You are brave.
Well, that stake president is now a general authority, so I guess I talked to the right person. But my current bishopric, I mentioned to them, I actually had watched for about a 6-month period of time. And then I emailed them and said, by the way, we haven't had a female closing speaker in 6 months in this ward. And my bishop's reaction initially was fairly defensive. Well, I don't think there's any reason why. And I'm like, I'm not arguing whether you think you're doing the right thing or not. I'm telling you that I have been keeping track, and there hasn't been a female closing speaker in 6 months in this ward. And to their credit, they then recognized that even though they didn't think that they had a bias, they were generating an unnatural bias in there. And so now it's very purposeful. But one thing that also had to change is one of the counselors was having, every time he called speakers, there would still be like the husband would be speaking last. And I called him and I said, look, brother, why, you're not having women as the closing speakers? Well, I always ask them and they never say they want to be the closing speaker. I'm
Yeah.
like, you got to get past that culture. Sometimes you just need to tell them women are not used to stepping up and taking authority in the LDS church. And I would say to women, we need to do that more. The men in my ward will tell you I'm not shy about doing that. Some of them usually run when I go towards them. But those are the kinds of things that I would say. You have to recognize that there are sometimes internal biases that you're not even aware of. So asking someone, Relief Society president, for advice about an elders quorum topic is extremely appropriate. When you're assigning talks for a sacrament meeting, be intentional about making sure that there are sometimes women as the closing speaker and not men.
That's a great example. Other things you'd like to share?
I think I'm good. At least for today.
Well, listeners, I've sure enjoyed having Lori LeVar Pierce on the podcast. This has been a personal joy for me just to listen to her and her perspective. It gives me hope for our church and recognize all the good Lori and many other people are doing in our faith community and beyond, and tamping down divisiveness and bringing us together as the same human family and developing community. I've learned a lot about Exponent too. It's been very helpful to me. I've been aware of Exponent. I've been following them on social media, reading their blog posts occasionally, including Candace's that was particularly insightful. We'll link to that in the pod in the show notes. So it just gives me hope for the future, and really admire Lori. You're brave. You're very self-intentional. You're very spiritually mature to chart your own course, and even when that navigates cultural headwinds. And I think that's a good example for all of us. And I think that's a good thing to create science. So this is Lori LeVar Pierce and Richard Ostler signing off from another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.